Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Sermon Preparation Workshop here from St. Martin in the Fields. Welcome. Sam, very nice to see you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody out there has ever had flu, but if you haven't, I really don't think you need to.
No, yeah, Sam is in the throes. I have just recovered from said flu, and also had the joy of trying to preach whilst flued up last Sunday. And I do not recommend. Do not try to preach whilst you have the flu, if it can be avoided. Sam, we are here to talk about the second Sunday before Lent, which will be on the 8th of February. But not only is it the second Sunday before Lent, it is, in the Church of England at least, recognised as Racial Justice Sunday. Can you tell us a little bit about what Racial Justice Sunday is, why we have it, and if people are marking it, how they might approach preaching for that?
Well, I think there's a story behind Racial Justice Sunday, which in the one of the, not the first thing to say, but an important thing to say is, because I know we have a lot of North American listeners as well as UK and elsewhere. With race, more than with any other subject, there's a tendency, and I'm not going to say the particular reasons or blame anybody for this, but there can be a tendency to assume that the North American story, particularly the story of slavery in America, is a template that fills in for race everywhere. And I experienced that when I lived in the United States, and I have seen the irritation of particularly Black theologians in this country who say this is not our story and this is just a different kind of imposition. This is not a correction. So I think the history of the Church of England devoting Sunday and the churches together in Britain and Ireland devoting a Sunday really goes back to Stephen Lawrence's murder in 1993, to the best of my knowledge, and the reports, the creation of, or the coining of, the term institutional racism, and the recognition, I guess, through that process in the 90s that the word reconciliation was not really the most helpful word. It may be the last word on the subject, but it certainly isn't one of the first 50 words on the subject.
Sure.
And jumping too quickly to the language of reconciliation was a kind of way of saying, let's close this down, nothing to see. Whereas what many people were asking for was to leave the wound open and untreated for some time, for people to recognize the depth of the wound. And the fact that the wound was still being inflicted, and it wasn't a historic thing, or simply a historic thing. It was a present tense thing, as the Stephen Lawrence murder exemplified. And that the church's job was not just to say, let's all be nice. Sometimes the church's job was to say, this is a really painful wound in our society, and the church's job may be simply to sit by that wound and to support those on whom it is most inflicted, to recognize its own history of being a big part of the inflicting. And I guess that was the point at which the language around race started to change from a rather benevolent, we realize there are those terrible racist people, and then there are those from minority ethnic backgrounds, and we are neither of those, which is obviously doubly problematic.
Yeah.
And othering, to use an expression that came along later. So I think the beginnings of turning that discourse round and saying that both of those categories are we, they're not, and sort of nuances that racism is not simply something that white people do to people of color. It's interesting, the phrase "people of color." It's there are circles in which the phrase "colored people" is anathema, but "people of color" is acceptable. It's a very subtle thing. People of color is basically an acceptable phrase in the United States, but colored people stopped being an acceptable phrase in this country 40 years ago. So it's very, very subtle. Anyhow, we know what we're talking about. That sense that I suppose three parts of the journey. So the pre-Stephen Lawrence era, I guess 60s, 70s, and 80s, where this was seen as part of social responsibility, community cohesion. The phrase race relations, we don't really hear that phrase anymore. And I guess the whole story from Windrush onwards, in other words, from the late 40s onwards. And then I think you get a hiatus in the 90s with the Stephen Lawrence crime. And then I guess that period, I think probably a historian would now say that period now goes through till 2020, till Black Lives Matter. Well, of course, Black Lives Matter preceded George Floyd, but it was the George Floyd murder in 2020 that brought that to a head. And then very much in that COVID period, again, this didn't start then. This had been going on 15 years, but the language of justice starts to replace, or significantly replaces, language around reconciliation. And justice is, it sounds like a more edgy, elbowy word, but it's not a panacea. It's not a simple solution, because when it comes to things like reparations, it's extremely difficult to work out what it actually entails. And that's not simply from people who are furious about the dissing of the colonial heritage and want to say, imperialism brought lots of good things to lots of good places. It's not just about that kind of backs to the wall resistance of the discourse, criticizing the National Trust for trying to re-narrate its paintings and explain how all these glorious country mansions were built in the 1740s from money that was quite quickly gained. And saying the National Trust shouldn't do that. They should just have nice buildings and arboretums and rhododendrons and green teas, and forget that the whole economy of the Caribbean generated all of this. And then, of course, at that stage, what's now the United States was still part of the British Empire. So the justice language, I think, takes over, in that period. And now we have a rather strange bifurcation, because rather like the climate change discourse, the DEI discourse, or EDI discourse, with the arrival of Trump and so on, has gone bang out of fashion. And yet the issues haven't really changed, and there's not many people who've changed their views about these things. It's just those whose voices were suppressed because they were out of fashion have been emboldened, and vice versa. Those who were emboldened by the EDI discourse and the climate change momentum have been silenced. So that's a brief history. It's not very brief history. That's a long history. So a flippant way to say it is that if you're picking up a liturgy from a website that was written more than 2 years ago, I strongly recommend that you hold it with kid gloves, because you may find the vocabulary is jars with your congregation. You really have to look at every single word to see if that's the most appropriate word today. But the big picture on all of it, I think, is, and I suppose another of the shadows in the back of this is this phrase critical race theory, which is, again, a much misunderstood term and a much manipulated term. And I don't use it because it, on the one hand, is a red rag to a bull to people on the right, and to people on the left, it's too inclined to become so impossibly sophisticated and difficult that no ordinary human being could possibly understand it, which is the opposite of what I'm trying to do in preaching. So, I would almost never use the term, even to say I'm now going to explain it, because I think it antagonizes people in both directions. But the short version of it is that it has now become extremely fashionable to tie racism to late stage capitalism or some phrase like that. I never understand how people use phrases like late stage as if they knew what stage of capitalism we were at, as if they were sort of speaking from 200 years time. But neoliberal capitalism, that sort of place it as part of the principalities and powers, if you like.
Yeah.
I don't know how this helps a congregation that 95% of people engaging with this podcast would ever be preaching to. So don't be intimidated. But do be scriptural. We've got some scriptures here that are well worth looking at in their own right. And then there are, it does behove any preacher on a Sunday like this to do a bit of homework and read. There's plenty of stuff online. You don't have to buy all the books. And don't be intimidated that there are only 2 books that matter. The conversation is dominated by African Americans, which intimidates Black people in the UK, let alone people of other races who might be very broadly described as Black, but in general terms in this country might be called Asian or other such terminology. Because one group have been most notoriously oppressed in the American story, that does not mean that other stories are worth telling. I guess the analogy I'd give is just because the First World War is so dominant in the imagination of Remembrance Sunday, that doesn't mean that every single Remembrance Sunday you have to tell a story from the trenches.
Yeah.
That actually you're doing something interesting by talking about people who came home from the Second World War in the Far East. That is a really interesting angle. For some people in Cumbria, that was what the war was. But, if you just do 1917 trenches, you're impoverishing the whole Remembrance Sunday tradition. And I would, doesn't mean you don't do it sometimes. And I have many times. But,
yeah.
And I would say the same about, about racist issues. I think anecdotes can be very helpful and simple. People will angst about whether they themselves, if they're not from a minority population, are the right person to speak. But I think everybody's the right person to speak. It's a bit like who's the right person to speak about safeguarding. If we say that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, then everyone has the right to speak about safeguarding.
Yeah.
And I feel the same about this issue. So I don't think this is the Sunday for Sunday saying, oh, we need to get a person from a minority ethnic background to speak, or a global majority, as it's sometimes called.
but the wisdom still of, you know, reading and finding stories from a range of
Well,
backgrounds and or
yeah,
theologians or whatever it might be. Yeah.
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 I mean, yeah, and you know that the internet
Depending.
makes it easier and easier all the time. You get AI
Yeah.
summaries. You say, what does J. Cameron Carter, you know, former colleague of mine at Duke, you know, what does his book Race: A Theological Account say? Well, you know, in no time, Google will point you to an AI that gives the whole thing to you in a paragraph.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you pass that off as a weeks of scholarship, but you're better
But the
informed.
information is there. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to say, "Oh, he's way above my head." You don't have
Yeah.
to say that. You
No.
find easy
There's
summaries.
no excuse really. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
we've said a lot about that.
Yes, let's. And obviously, if any of, as we go through these readings, if any of them speak, you think specifically into this as well, then please do
I guess
enlighten
the
us.
last thing, yeah, the last thing to say about all of that. I mean, I have the same. I'm a bit of a broken record, and people who know my stuff well are more than used to the fact that I say more or less the same thing about every subject. And you know what I say about subjects like this is, I don't think justice is the most helpful word theologically. I understand, you know, as far as society is concerned. I think theologically the issue is God has given us everything we need, and if we fail to receive the abundance God gives us in the form in which God sends it, then we've only got ourselves to blame if we experience our lives as scarcity. And you know, I think that story is never more filled out in the story of the Church of England in the Windrush era, where it failed to receive, particularly people coming from the Caribbean, who often came from Anglo-Catholic backgrounds because it was a USPG mission area. And were horrified to find they weren't welcome in Church of England churches, which have subsequently declined. Well, whose fault was that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that example, absolutely. You know, if the church had received everything that God was sending it in 1947, we'd be in a very, very different church today. And the people to blame for that are the people, the white people in the churches that excluded the Caribbean population. So.
Yeah.
You know, that's not, if you see it as the rights of the Windrush generation, then obviously that's injustice and discrimination and so on, which it is. I'm not denying that, but I don't think that's interesting theologically. It's obvious. What's interesting is that the people were actually impoverishing themselves. I find that much more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've
Good.
got Genesis 1.
Okay.
People
Genesis
probably
1
not
in the very
familiar with
beginning.
that.
Back to the beginning of the Bible.
So Genesis 1 is a really tricky area because A, everyone thinks they know it. B, for a lot of people, that's as far through the Bible as they ever get. And C, it does portray a biblical worldview as one that is generally regarded as, you know, wholly incompatible with a with a scientific worldview in natural science. Sure. So all of those things are quite difficult. The other problem, more practical, is it's a very, very long
and repetitive. Yeah.
And
I remember somebody once saying to me, asking me to read it. It was at the Easter Vigil, you know, and saying, "Oh, please, would you read it? And can you just try to make sure it's not boring? It's always so long and boring." Well, it's not that
the
helpful.
thing about Easter Vigil is if you skipped out half a dozen paragraphs, but
yeah, exactly.
So it's very much your discretion. I have in the past, and I probably will when this comes to be in the be read, not in a few days' time. Done a précis of this because I don't think it serves anybody for everyone's concentration to wander away. People might say, "Oh, these are great words," you know, so on. It's a very, very long reading, and they haven't précised it, but I think you should feel able to. And if you want to use the one that I've used, then I'm sure you can get in touch with some Martins or Heart Edge or whatever. So again, this Sunday was created in the Church of England Lectionary. These readings don't appear in the Revised Common Lectionary, which will be used in most American Protestant churches, and Catholic churches. It was created because they felt in the late 90s, can you believe this? They needed more material on creation. the ecological issues were so pressing in the late 90s. Just imagine that when they created, the lectionary that we now use every Sunday, they added this, they changed the readings for this Sunday.
Right.
For this reason. So it's what it's asking you to preach on is either the abundance, the goodness, the fullness, the plan, the vision of God's creation, or this controversial area, fill the earth and subdue it, over the fish of the sea, etc.
Yeah.
Lynn White's famous 1967 article in Nature, "The Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," I think it was called. Takes Christianity to task for being the source of our climate problem.
Yeah.
1967. I mean, some American presidents haven't yet read it. So you can do that if you want to, but you're probably preaching to the choir. I mean, is it really worth making that argument? You can do a straightforward sermon on how important creation is and how terrible it is that we're wrecking it. If you want to, I think people might switch off because they feel they know that, and it makes this a challenging subject to preach on. But it is one of the great passages of Scripture. You can't argue with that, and I think I'd be more inclined to tie it in with the racial justice issues and talk about what good might look like racially, rather than just concentrate on the many egregious failures. Not least because you have to be very, very careful at the moment for every sermon not to end up being about Trump.
Yes, quite.
Or ICE, more narrowly. And I think that's a temptation that not everybody is able to resist. But I don't think our congregations want every Sunday to come and be told that Trump's not a very good thing. I think they already know.
I've heard you mention as well in the past, particularly when talking about race and stuff, about the scriptural language around light and darkness. And I wonder whether this might be a passage to help speak into that a bit as well.
Yeah, very much so. That's a very good point. I think it's not sufficiently appreciated, even by some quite sophisticated preachers and scholars. And there's no question how profound light and darkness are in the tradition. They're all over Scripture. But I pastorally have become convinced that it's something that needs to be downplayed, rather than somehow reincorporated. I don't think we're ready for that yet. I think as long as there are people who don't even hear it,
yes,
then I think we need to highlight it rather than to step over it.
Yeah.
We have got only 5 minutes to look
Yes, we're going to carry on then. Romans 8. Let's have a look at that.
So I think this is much more. Well, this is a very so the first reading is Haydn's creation. It's all joyous and glorious. There's no fall in it. The second is all about bondage, and the whole creation's been groaning in labour pains, and we groan inwardly again. You've got lots of groaning there. And then we end up with a sense of hope and patience. I think you've got your choice, really. You do the upbeat, isn't creation wonderful? This is what it can be like. And then you've got but it's all, we're just waiting for God to step in and bring the curtain down, because this is really tough labour pains. So you take your pick, I think, of those two, but I can tell you which one's the shorter one. And then you've got, in a sense, the one that people, I suspect, are most likely to go for, which is the lilies of the field.
Yeah, so Matthew 6. I won't say too much. We don't have a lot of time. You say it, but this is one of my tasks earlier last term was to look at this passage and to try and to argue as to whether this was actually saying anything about the environment and the climate or not.
And what did you say?
Well, of course, scholars differ.
Yeah, my It's good to see that the old theological get-out clauses still apply. So one of the phrases that I've been reflecting on, I've used the word abundance a lot in the last 25 years, but superfluity is a slightly different word from abundance, because they both mean too much, or more than is needed. But superfluity, abundance suggests, it's all wonderful and there's too much, but it's sort of overflowing in goodness. Superfluity is a kind of almost inherently wasteful, that wastefulness is built into God's abundance.
Yes.
And this is and the reason why I think all of that matters, and why I would almost always go for this reading over the other two, is because there can be a sort of earnestness, waste not, want not kind of ethic about creation care, which is all very moral and ethical and so on, just not very theological and scriptural. There is waste, there is just too much, and the heart of this is, why is there a creation at all? That's the question I think you want to be answering. And I don't think, and I get on one of my hobby horses here, and I talk about this quite a lot in my book, Constructing an Incarnational Theology. I don't think conventional theology has a very good answer to that question. It tends to kick in, Jesus came because of the fall and it all went wrong and he had to rescue it. But what was he rescuing? Is he rescuing to get back to something? And if he gets us back to something, what was that original blessing, to use Matthew Fox's phrase? What do we still die? All of these kind of questions. What is the goodness of creation? And what, in a quite a subversive and yet playful way, Jesus himself, you'd think quite a significant authority, basically, teases us by saying, it's the lilies that get this. They understand this. Not the scholars, not the earnest campaigners. The lilies are closer to God's heart. It's not the oppressed, it's the lilies. Consider the lilies. So there is something not just playfully subversive there, but something pointing us to chill on quite a cosmic level. Obviously the new revised, updated Bible has a subheading on Matthew 6 saying, "Do not overthink." It's or something along those lines. Because it really is almost an anti-earnest passage. Don't try to be wiser than God. If God's wisdom is that creation is superfluous, it's not needed. It's not utilitarian. It's not to serve a function. It's just because it's beautiful. Like people who were asked, why they climbed Everest, and said because it's there. It is what it is.
Yeah.
So I think
and a celebration of that.
Yeah. So tying all that back to racial justice, that's the problem with naming a Sunday. It's very worthy. Obviously, the issues involved with racial justice are very, very important. They're always in danger of being less urgent than whatever else is on people's mind. So absolutely right to keep a Sunday, but then with a Sunday that's already got a theme, which is creation. Good luck with that. I've tried to offer some pointers about where you can do it. I think what it comes down to is how the diversity of creation, which includes the diversity of race, whether or not race is really a thing. It clearly is experienced as a thing, is part of God's good creation and is not a problem. We make it a problem, but that's our loss when we do so. It's part of the over-resourcing, the superfluity of diversity that is in God's original purpose.
Very good, Sam. Thank you so much for that and for your insights. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a pleasure as always. We will sign off now, and we will be back next Tuesday for more sermon preparation work.